Late last year, the federal government made the 1931 Canadian census available online, a genealogist's dream come true. To date, we now have census data available online more or less from 1851 to 1931. I say more or less because in the early census years, Canada was not the large confederation of provinces and territories we now have. And even in those early provinces that came to be part of Canada, there is missing data. The pre-Confederation censuses were undertaken by the various provinces, Canada East, Canada West, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia. And although here in Nova Scotia there are other records one can access, the censuses we cover in this presentation will be the nominal ones digitized by Library and Archives Canada, also known as LAC. We will explore the evolution of the census in Canada, the purposes it served, how it was conducted, and then zero in on the 1931 census as it relates to East Hants. We're a country that likes to keep track of our population, and that is the primary purpose of the census, to track and tabulate population density and movement. Perhaps this comes from our dominant ancestry, British. Over the centuries, the British took censuses for various purposes. Example, in the 1600s, they conducted muster rolls in Ireland, where in recent decades they had planted settlers from England, Scotland, and Wales. Each muster roll consisted of a record of all of the men in various townlands of Ireland and the weapons they had at their disposal. The purpose was twofold. One, to control the indigenous population of Ireland, and two, to guard the back door in case the Spanish decided to spring another Armada attack on England. And there were other lists of people residing in parishes that predate this population account. Today, the census's primary role is to tabulate population distribution so that electoral boundaries can be drawn to better reflect the number of voters. After 1891, the electoral map would be reviewed following every census. And you may recall the discussion a year or so back about changing the King's Hants boundaries following the 2021 census. Here in Canada, random census records were taken from about 1670 onward. But for Nova Scotia, the earliest online at LAC is 1851, and it is quite limited. Only returns for Halifax, Kings, and Pictou counties survive. It's likely that records from other districts, if those were enumerated, didn't survive. So, what data were collected in Nova Scotia for the 1851 census? In Schedule 1, which you will find online at LAC, the focus was on production. The only name recorded per household was that of the head. Others were not listed by names, but by age groups and gender. Males and females under 10, 10 to 20, 20 to 30, and so on. Buildings on the property, those inhabited, uninhabited, barns, storage, outhouses were also listed. The 1851 census is the only one that asks questions about what was manufactured. Malt liquor, distilled liquor, bricks, maple sugar, butter, and cheese. How many casks of lime were burned? Probably for blacksmith work. Grindstones and gypsum quarried, vessels or boats built. The emphasis is clearly on employment and industry. Grist mills and foundries were essential to every community, and gypsum was quarried in many places in East Hants. South Maitland was known as Rockville for a long while, and shipbuilding was a major industry along the Cobequid shore. Agriculture was a foundational enterprise, with proceeds from sales at the farm gate as well as food on the table. By 1861, the focus had changed somewhat. First, the East Hants subdistrict of Hants included Maitland, Knoll, 9 Mile River, South Rawdon, and Rawdon Church. Family became the important focus, not the economy. Even so, the head is still the only person named, but other questions related to the family are asked, such as the demographics of births and deaths per gender for children under age 2, and who in the household married in the last year. Other topics focus on infirmities and literacy. Infirmities include, and I quote, deaf and dumb, blind, lunatic, idiot. Can the person aged 5 to 15 years and aged 15 and older read or write? There are no questions about industry or economy on this form. The first two census returns post-Confederation, 1871 and 1881, mark a change from the 1861 form with additions to the categories. The census forms for these 2 decades, Nominal Return of the Living, do not focus on industry either, but the topics around household residents are expanded. The sub-districts are the same, except Rawdon Church becomes Rawdon North, South Rawdon is renamed Rawdon South, and Walton and Shubenacadie are added to the list. For the first time, the names of additional residents of the household, family or otherwise, are required. Within the personal category, gender, age, if born within the previous 12 months, and country or province of birth, if born in Canada, are required. Religion, ancestral origin, for example, Scotch, the term then used, English, Irish, etc., and profession, occupation, or trade also show up on these censuses. Also, for the first time, the return asks for marital status, married or widowed, or married within the previous year. A section deals with education, whether the person is attending school or is over the age of 20 and unable to read or write. Infirmities continue to be an item. Deaf and dumb and blind are there, but lunatic and idiot become unsound mind. A question is also asked about operations, surgeries, their dates, and any remarks about them. Under numbered in the order of visitation, located at the far left of the form, there is also a return to questions about built structures, dwellings under construction, those uninhabited, the number inhabited if more than one on the property, including shanties and vessels. 2 columns are named dwelling houses inhabited and families. The families column contains the number of a family group with the head of household directly to its right. One dwelling could contain 2 or more families, the head of each family numbered in the immediate left column. Therefore, the number under families eventually becomes larger than the dwellings column as the enumerator makes his way from one property to the next. This is also the messiest section of the census sheet, as errors in counting the inhabited dwellings in the order they were visited are numerous. Moving on to 1891, we find some changes in the sub-districts. Maitland, Knoll, Shubenacadie, 9 Mile River, and Walton continue, and additions include 5 Mile River, Gore, Selma, South Maitland, with Uniacke added to South Rawdon, and Rawdon North changed back to Rawdon Church. There are several significant additions to the questions, including father's and mother's place of birth, the relationship of the family to the head of household, and whether the person is French Canadian. Relationship is important, as we will note the presence of grandparents or other relatives beneath the names of children of the head, servants, or lodgers. No more questions about surgeries. A new section is added in 1891 pertaining to employment. Is the person an employer or wage earner? If employer, what is the average number of hands employed during the previous year? Was the wage earner unemployed during the week prior to the census? it's likely that there was a growing trend towards employment off the home property, or in addition, working off as well as working on one's property, common in rural areas where a man might own a farm, be milking cows or raising hens and selling his produce, but also be working as well in the local gravel pit or quarry or on a loading dock. By 1901, the subdistricts have changed yet again. The Rawdon subdistricts have been renamed, and 3 others have been rolled into other subdistricts. 5 Mile River becomes part of Knoll, and Selma and South Maitland are now probably part of Maitland, perhaps reflecting population decline as the shipbuilding industry is beginning to fade. In 1901, we also find the categories more in-depth and personal. Age is nailed down to year, month, and date. Marital status now includes single and divorced. One's color is now requested. Gender remains as well as relationship to household head. A new category, citizenship, nationality, and religion, requires information about immigration and naturalization, race, generally white or Negro, or tribal origin, Mi'kmaq or Indian, as well as original nationality of immigrants. Also, for the first time, mother tongue is requested, which would include speakers of Gaelic, a language common among the earliest settlers in East Hants after the American Revolution. Employment data also takes a deeper dive into the work lives of householders. Now enumerators ask for profession, occupation, or trade, not just whether persons are employers or employees. And they want to know if the person is retired, adding an R if that's the case. Working on own account is also new, meaning employed by self, and living on own means would relate to those whose working days may be over and or they have the financial means to support themselves, which might include shipbuilders or captains, doctors, lawyers, and the like. A section is also devoted to the wage earner, asking questions about where their trade is practiced, home or factory, months of employment in their trade, plus months working at other than their trade. This category would include people who perhaps are sawyers or machinists, but also keep a few head of milk cows or a flock of chickens and sell butter or eggs. A statement of their earnings from their trade is required, as well as any work outside their occupation or trade. One assumes the intent of these questions would be to track the shift from a colony to a full-fledged country. For instance, moving from being a heavily resource-based economy to one more industrialized and profession-oriented, gauging the levels of poverty or wealth in the country, and perhaps for making decisions about funding of social assistance of one sort or another, trying to determine the industriousness and character of various ethnic groups in order to set immigration policies as the country expanded, or even to assist in setting brackets for tax purposes. This is when we start to really see the growth of Canada as we head into a new century. Moving on to 1911, we find a significant change in the census subdistricts. Within designated areas of East Hants, as shown on the next 2 slides, communities and/or regions are grouped by subdistrict numbers according to electoral poll districts. For example, on this slide, Douglas poll subdistricts include the numbers you see here, each number representing a community group within what was once known as Douglas Township. The township was named by Major John Small, commanding officer of the 2nd Battalion of the 84th Regiment after the American Revolution, when he received the 82,000 plus acres to divvy up among his disbanded soldiers. Similarly, on this next slide, you can see the other districts, Rawdon Township subdistricts and Walton. Both of these would include portions of West Hants. Another significant change is a new polling district designation to include the Mi'kmaq communities of Indian Brook outside Shubenacadie and Glooscap outside Falmouth in West Hants. Also, you can see some little anomalies, such as 9 Mile River and Belknap, included in the Rod and Pole districts when they were originally part of Douglas Township. Regarding the questions asked, there is no real change to the citizenship and profession categories, but the wage earners section looks for more detail about place of employment. Are respondents working on farms, at mills? What are their total earnings from their chief occupation, as well as any other occupation? At what rate are they paid in cents? Imagine thinking of 1911 cents in terms of 2021 dollars. For the first time, respondents are asked what kind of insurance they hold and at what cost in the census year. Under education, a question is asked about how much education costs for persons over age 15 in a college, convent, or university. Did this also apply to younger persons in public or private schools? As even in public schools, textbooks had to be purchased by the student. Perhaps the most jaw-dropping item to be added to the 1911 census concerned infirmity. The age at which the infirmity appeared had to be given, but the categories of infirmity were expanded to include crazy, idiotic, or silly. Today, those are pejorative terms when used to name mental deficiencies. But although I've never seen silly ever used professionally to describe a person's mental condition. But back in the day, they were considered appropriate. In fact, in a death certificate in 1950 for a 19-year-old who had been blind, deaf, dumb, and incapable of movement on her own, names the contributing factor to her death as imbecile, and that's a medical doctor's proper term. That term, or moron, has also been seen on the intake record for several individuals at the East Hants Municipal Home in South Maitland. Those were the days. On to 1921, we see more changes in the sub-districts, including a change in the numbering from 1911. Also, the census sub-district numbers do not correspond to the electoral poll district numbers. The Rawdon census sub-districts, numbers 12 and 13, are located in this area of East Hants. And here you have the numbers 14 and 15 along the Cobequid shore. Also, the Selma group with Knoll Shore and Sterling Brook here. Numbers 16 and 17 are located here, Elmsdale and area. On the next slide, you have 18 and 19 here. Along the Shubenacadie River, we have numbers 23 and 24. Inland, the sub-districts include 21, 26, and 27. Indian Brook has its own number, 32. In both 1911 and 1921, you'll note that there are sub-districts that appear to overlap with West Hants since they are associated with the federal electoral poll districts. These community names are all on today's East Hants maps, with the exception of Hennigar. Hennigar was at one time the name of the postal way station on the Georgefield Road and is no longer used. Under name and residence, the census asks for more precise data about where each person lives. Is it a rural or urban abode? And if urban, what is the name and civic number of the street? If it's rural, is it a parish or a township? There are also questions about the tenure and class of home. Is it owned or rented? And if rented, for how much? What kind of house and construction material is it? And how many rooms does the family occupy? Marital status now includes legally separated, but, spoiler alert, by the 1931 census, that is removed. In the citizenship section, under nationality, the question asks, to what country does the person owe allegiance? Is this a question arising out of the history of the preceding decade that saw World War I lay down some distinct divisions and boundaries regarding loyalty? There is more detail requested for languages spoken, probably reflecting immigration from other countries where English is not the official language, and perhaps also a result of migration following the war. Regarding employment, earnings, and unemployment, specific questions ask about unemployment status over the previous 12 months and since June 1st, 1920. A significant change is that the questions about infirmity were dropped from the 1921 census. It would be interesting to know who or what movement brought this about. Maybe the number of veterans of World War I returning home with what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder. No more lunatic or silly references. In 1931, there are changes that really slim down the sub-district names. Plus, the census district name is changed from Hants to Hants-Kings to reflect the fact that, by that time, the federal electoral district encompasses both Hants and Kings counties. You can see the sub-districts here. 9 Mile Road is an interesting departure from 9 Mile River. Note that Kempt Point is in West Hants, as is part of Walton. This is the first census in which the East Hants Municipal Home in South Maitland is listed as a separate sub-district. Likewise, the Indian Residential School in Shubenacadie and the residents of Indian Brook are now grouped together as one sub-district. Now, because the residential school served both Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, Mi'kmaq students from all over Nova Scotia and New Brunswick are represented in this report. In this section on the home, the census asks what the value of the home is if it is owned by the household head. And a key first asks whether the household has a radio. I suspect that ownership of a radio would signify a position on a social or economic ladder and whether electricity had reached the household, as well as interest in news and entertainment. From a government perspective, it could be a way to gauge radio's possible use in getting information out to people quickly. Note that the reference to tribal origin has been dropped from this census, likely because it is more appropriately covered elsewhere. The section on unemployment asks more pointed questions about the nature of the unemployment, if it occurred. If you weren't working on Monday, June 1st, 1931, why not? How many weeks were you unemployed in the last 12 months? How many weeks were you unemployed due to no job, illness, accident, strike or lockout, temporary layoff, or other causes? These questions are key to the economic history of that time. The Great Depression had begun in 1929 with the crash of the stock market, and by the time of the 1931 census, no one knew how long it was going to last. Plus, unions were beginning to get some teeth. The labor force was pushing hard to unionize within the companies they worked for, gypsum operations and mills, for example, and fighting for their rights as employees to better wages, better working hours, vacation time, and so on. This section of the census was likely intended to give the federal government a better understanding of how the Great Depression was affecting the populace and the economy. Now, let's look at the person who completed all these house-to-house information gathering procedures. Who was the enumerator? His or her name appears at the top of every census sheet. In the 1931 census, these people are some of the East Hants enumerators: Ralph Laffin, Benjamin McLaren, Alexander Snyde, Robert Miller, and Teresa Burgess, to name a few. The job of enumerator would not have been an easy one. You would need good command of the language, and you had to be trustworthy. In the early censuses, you would be traveling by horse and buggy, and given the size of the territory covered, you likely had to find a room for overnight sometimes. You had to take an oath that you would not willfully make a false declaration, and you had to seek out every household in your subdistrict, maybe more than once if there was no one at home the first time you arrived. You were required to visit vessels at dock if they were residences, as well as shanties in the woods off the beaten track. You had to complete the record for each house before moving to the next one. No backspace option available if you made an error or left someone off a household list they belonged in. And one wishes that good penmanship had also been one of the qualifications for the job. And that brings us to the records themselves. The actual sheets of paper enumerators completed for the nominal return of the living can be viewed online at Library and Archives Canada in their digital format, the names having been transcribed into a searchable database. But to get to those names, you require an accurate rendering of the name in the digital transcription. Mistakes in the transcription are common for several reasons. Poor handwriting not only makes the words hard to decipher, but can also cause wrong letters to be used in the transcription. So Densmore might get transcribed as Insmore, for example, and you might never find the person that you're looking for. Contributing to the poor handwriting is the ink used, not erasable and prone to blotching, especially if a mistake is crossed out. Variant spellings of names mean you might have to try several different spellings to find your person. For example, Mick or Mac to find the McDonald you seek, or McLaren for McLaren, or Layton for Leighton. It could be a spelling error on the part of the enumerator, especially if the person giving the information about the name can't spell it, but it can also be a transcription error. Faded print on the original sheets or any other kind of damage can cause transcription issues as well. Enumerator issues can also result in wrong or missing information on the form itself. Members of households may be temporarily away from home. For example, seamen who are aboard their ship, or workers who lived in a rural area but boarded in a city where their job was, were considered members of the rural household, but may be overlooked. Also, if the enumerator does not know the family well, little untruths about age or relationship to the head of household might lead to wrong information. When you look at the new census search format LAC is in the process of setting up, you get a really useful format that gives you some interesting search possibilities. Let's take the 1931 census as an example. If you open the search form at LAC, the URL is on the screen, it will bring up a screen that allows you to search all the censuses with one input of data. When, to select the years or year you want to search. Who, the name of the person you are searching, plus age data if you know it. Where, all the provinces and territories you want to search, if you're uncertain of the province or territory in question. And under More, the census district, sub-district, number help to narrow the search if you know them. You can conduct either a broad search, that is the whole province, or a narrow one by inputting a specific district and sub-district, which will return fewer individuals having the same name. For example, a province of Nova Scotia search in 1931 for a John McClellan will return 75 instances of that name, whereas narrowing the search to Hants Kings will give you one in Kempt Point and Walton subdistrict. A real bonus is that when a sheet comes up for a name you have input, all the other sheets for that subdistrict will be lined up with it at the bottom of the screen in the order in which the enumerator compiled the names. So, if a name you're looking for doesn't come up in the search, but you think the person might have lived in a particular sub-district, you can leave out the name in your search, but put in the sub-district, and all the sheets will come up. Then you can start with the first one and read all the names to do an in-depth search for the person. For example, if I input Gore sub-district, but no name for the 1931 census, it will bring up 24 sheets, the first of which identifies the sub-district and all the communities that are part of it. The remainder contain the households in the order in which the enumerator visited their homes and recorded their names. So, sheet number 2 starts with household number 1. Do not assume the enumerator advanced house by house in the geographical sense. That is, along the same side of the road until complete. He may have, but sometimes he may have had to return because there was no one home at the next house, or it was too late to stop, and he had to go home and start over again the next day, and perhaps went to a different place in the sub-district. Also, do not assume that every enumerator carried out his tasks in the same way. Some may have input names of communities incorrectly if boundaries were not well defined. What can a person do with all this 1931 census data? The most obvious use of it is to aid in compiling a family genealogy and family history. Discover the infant your grandmother gave birth to, the one she never spoke of, that died of pneumonia when it was age 2. Draw conclusions about the kind of family, education, economic status, marital status you belong to. At least some data to begin with to start to write your family history. Compare the census reports for the same family over 20 or 30 years to learn whether the head of household changed, how old the adult children were before they moved on to their own households, if ever. Was it common for a young adult to bring his or her new spouse into the parents' home? Where did the money come from? What occupations? You can also determine, to some extent, social and economic status within the community and between communities. You can compare population numbers, the economic differences between sub-districts by looking at the professions, occupations, the number that are employers as opposed to employees, for example. In the 1931 9 Mile Road sub-district, 46 households out of 233 owned a radio. What does that tell you? They have money? Electricity has reached their households? Or they wanted to keep up with technological advances? Comparing census records from different years can play an important role in tracking economic or population changes over the years, perhaps for a specific district or sub-district. For example, an in-depth look at families in a sub-district in the 1921 census, when many people went away to the United States to find work, and then comparing it with 1931, 2 years into the Great Depression, might show that many of those young men and women returned to their Canadian homes because too many Americans also needed work, so Canadians were discouraged from staying. Or you can compare different aspects of the same community from different census years. Or compare the 1871 census for 9 Mile River with the 1931 census. How many men state minor as the occupation in each of those 2 years? You can plot the rise and fall of gold mining or gypsum quarrying over the years the census was taken. An interesting project for a high school economics class. The 1931 census may be especially interesting to people who were growing up in the late 40s and on, because they are going to know some of those people outside their own families. The neighbors, the old man in the back road who drove by in his horse and buggy a couple of times a month to the local post office and grocery store. And they will have grown up with the children or grandchildren of those people. Make the most of it. The next census to be released will be the 1941 census, but not until 2033, 92 years after it was taken.